The last wagon wheel of the Zakarsky family caravan disappeared over the horizon, leaving Lillian Zander alone in the brutal August heat of 1876, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small cloth bundle of meager possessions. Her father's final words still rang in her ears. "No daughter of mine will bring such disgrace upon our name. You are dead to us now." Lillian stood motionless on the dusty trail outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, watching as the last traces of her family vanished. At 22, she had never been alone, always surrounded by her 5 brothers and 3 sisters in their crowded family wagon. Now, cast out for refusing to marry the elderly banker, her father had chosen a man who had buried 3 wives. Already she faced a world that offered few options for a woman without family or connections. The sun beat down mercilessly as Lillian's honey-colored hair clung to her tear-stained cheeks. She had not expected her refusal to result in complete banishment. Her mother had not even been allowed to embrace her goodbye. In her bundle, she carried only a spare dress, a hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother, and $10 she had secretly saved over the years from selling her embroidery work. Lillian took a tentative step toward Santa Fe, her worn boots kicking up dust. She had heard there was work for women in town laundry, cooking, or worse. The thought made her shudder, but survival demanded practicality. As she walked, the weight of her situation pressed upon her shoulders, heavier than the scorching sun above. 2 hours later, her throat parched and feet blistered. Lillian stumbled into the outskirts of Santa Fe. The town buzzed with activity traders bartering goods, cowboys fresh off the trail spending their wages, and respectable townspeople hurrying about their business. No one spared a glance for the young woman with dust-covered clothes and desperation in her eyes. Lillian approached the first establishment that looked respectable enough, a general store, with a hand-painted sign reading Wilson's Mercantile. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, the bell above jingling to announce her entrance. "Help you, miss." A thin man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from behind the counter. I am looking for work, sir," Lillian said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can sew, cook, and keep accounts." The man's eyes narrowed as he assessed her disheveled appearance. "Don't need help. Try the saloon down the street. They're always looking for pretty girls." His dismissive tone left no room for argument. Lillian backed away, cheeks burning with shame. She knew what work at the saloon entailed. Stepping back onto the street, she felt the curious stares of passers-by who had overheard the exchange. With each rejection at subsequent businesses, her options narrowed. By dusk, exhausted and increasingly desperate, Lillian found herself sitting on a bench outside the town's small church, wondering if the pastor might offer refuge for the night. She didn't notice the tall figure approaching until a shadow fell across her face. "Miss, you look like you could use some assistance." Lillian looked up to see a man standing before her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky. His clothes were dusty but well-kept denims, a faded blue shirt, and a worn leather vest. A cowboy hat was pushed back on his head, revealing eyes the color of a clear winter sky. "I'm quite all right, thank you," Lillian said automatically, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The stranger's gaze was direct but not unkind. "Forgive my presumption, but you've been sitting here for nearly an hour and I'd wager you haven't eaten today." He extended a hand. "Zachary Wilkes. I run a small cattle operation about 5 miles outside of town." Lillian hesitated. Her mother had warned her about strange men, but desperation had a way of reshaping one's boundaries. "Lillian Zander," she replied, not taking his hand. If Zachary was offended, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded toward a small restaurant across the street. "Would you allow me to buy you supper, Miss Zander? No obligations, just a meal." Her stomach growled loudly in response, making the decision for her. Zachary smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I'll take that as a yes." The restaurant was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps casting a warm glow over the half-dozen tables. Zachary guided Lillian to a corner table, maintaining a respectful distance that put her somewhat at ease. When the owner, a plump woman with a kind face, approached, Zachary ordered stew and fresh bread for them both without consulting a menu. "Martha makes the best venison stew in the territory," he explained. As they waited for their food, Lillian's discomfort grew under Zachary's steady gaze. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Wilkes?" she finally asked. "Call me Zach," he replied, then paused as Martha set 2 steaming bowls before them. He waited until Lillian had taken her first desperate spoonful before continuing. "3 years ago, I arrived in Santa Fe with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. A rancher named Thomas Miller took a chance on me when no one else would. Now I try to do the same when I see someone in need." Lillian slowed her eating, embarrassed by her initial hunger. "That's very charitable of you, not charity, just common decency." Zach broke a piece of bread and passed half to her. "So, Miss Zander, what brings you to Santa Fe alone?" Lillian stared into her stew, debating how much to reveal. "My family and I disagree on what my future should hold," she said carefully. "They continued on without me. They left you here, alone." Zach's voice hardened slightly. "I refuse to marry the man my father chose," Lillian admitted, lifting her chin. "He was nearly 60, wealthy but cruel. My father said I brought shame to the family by defying him publicly." Zach was quiet for a moment. "Some might call that courage, not shame." Lillian looked up in surprise. No one had ever suggested her defiance might be anything but selfish disobedience. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Find work, I suppose, though it seems options for a woman alone are limited." Zach nodded thoughtfully. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Zander. I'm in need of someone to help keep my house and accounts in order. It's not much, a small ranch house with a bunkhouse for my 2 hands, but it's honest work with fair pay." Lillian narrowed her eyes. "And what would you expect in return, Mr. Wilkes?" "Your labor, nothing more," he said firmly. "You'd have your own room with a lock on the door. My men know to behave respectably or find work elsewhere, and if you're uncomfortable at any time, I'll bring you back to town with a week's wages." The offer seemed too good to be true, but as Lillian studied his open expression, she saw no deception there. Still, caution prevailed. "How do I know I can trust you?" Zach smiled slightly. "You don't. But I can give you references. Martha here, Sheriff Patterson, and Pastor Evans all know me well, or you can take your chances in town." Lillian glanced around the restaurant where several men were already casting interested looks in her direction. The decision wasn't difficult. "When would we leave?" she asked. "First light tomorrow. You can stay at the boarding house tonight. Martha's sister runs it. I'll settle the bill." By the time they finished their meal, Lillian had agreed to accompany Zachary Wilkes to his ranch, if only because every other door in Santa Fe seemed firmly closed to her. That night, in the clean but sparse room at the boarding house, she slept fitfully, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Morning came too quickly. Lillian dressed in her one spare dress, a simple blue cotton garment that had seen better days. She pinned her hair neatly and packed her few belongings. When she descended the stairs, Zach was waiting in the small foyer, hat in hand. Beside him stood a middle-aged woman with a severe bun and sharp eyes. "Miss Zander, this is Mrs. Campbell. She's agreed to accompany us to the ranch as a chaperone." Relief flooded through Lillian. No man with dishonorable intentions would bring a chaperone. Mrs. Campbell gave her a brisk nod, her assessment clearly ongoing. Outside, a wagon waited, already loaded with supplies. Zach helped both women up to the bench seat before climbing up himself, positioning Mrs. Campbell between them. As they pulled away from Santa Fe, Lillian felt a curious mixture of fear and hope flutter in her chest. The journey passed in relative silence, broken only by Zach's occasional comments about the land they passed. 5 miles stretched longer than Lillian had anticipated, the terrain growing rougher as they left the main trail. Finally, they crested a rise, and Zach pulled the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Not much, but it's mine." Below them stretched a modest ranch nestled in a small valley. A creek wound through the property, and perhaps 36 cattle grazed in the nearest pasture. The ranch house was simple but solid-looking, with a covered porch and smoke rising from the chimney. A smaller bunkhouse stood nearby, along with a barn and corral where several horses milled about. "It's lovely," Lillian said honestly, surprised by the sense of peace that washed over her at the sight. Mrs. Campbell sniffed. "It needs a woman's touch, that's certain." She turned to Lillian. "The inside is a disaster. Hope you're not afraid of hard work, girl." "I've never shied away from work," Lillian replied, straightening her shoulders. Zach clicked to the horses and they continued down the slope. As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn, one older with graying hair, the other barely out of his teens. Both looked curiously at the wagon's passengers. "That's Frank and Tommy," Zach explained. "Good men. Frank's been working cattle since before I was born. Tommy's learning, but he's quick and willing." The men touched their hats respectfully as Zach helped the women down from the wagon. "Boys, this is Miss Zander. She'll be keeping house and accounts for us. And Mrs. Campbell, who'll be staying with us for a time." Frank nodded, his weathered face impassive. "Madam." "Miss," Tommy stared at Lillian with undisguised curiosity until Frank elbowed him in the ribs. "Show Miss Zander and Mrs. Campbell to their rooms, please," Zach instructed. "Then help unload the supplies." Lillian followed the men toward the house, aware of Zach's gaze on her back. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she ascended to the porch. Inside, she found a space that was indeed in dire need of attention, clean but chaotic, with dishes piled haphazardly on shelves, clothes draped over chairs, and a layer of dust on nearly every surface. "Men," Mrs. Campbell muttered disapprovingly. Frank led them down a short hallway. "This here's your room, miss," he said, opening a door to reveal a small but pleasant space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the creek. As promised, the door had a sturdy lock. "Thank you," Lillian said, stepping inside and placing her bundle on the bed. "Get settled, then come to the kitchen," Mrs. Campbell instructed. "We'll start with a proper inventory." Left alone, Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, allowing herself a moment to absorb her new situation. Yesterday, she had been cast out, alone and desperate. Today, she had shelter, the promise of work, and perhaps, if she was very fortunate, a chance to build something new. The week that followed was a flurry of activity. Under Mrs. Campbell's exacting supervision, Lillian scrubbed, organized, and transformed the ranch house into a functional home. Zach and his men kept their distance, spending long days with the cattle and returning only for meals, which improved dramatically once Lillian took over the cooking. On the 7th day, Mrs. Campbell announced her intention to return to town. "You seem settled enough," she told Lillian privately. "And Wilkes is a decent sort. Still, keep that door locked at night." After Mrs. Campbell's departure, a new rhythm established itself at the ranch. Lillian rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing, and her afternoons working on the accounts or tending the small kitchen garden she had discovered overrun with weeds. In the evenings, she served dinner to the men, then retired to her room with a book borrowed from Zach's small collection. Zach himself remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, thanking Lillian for every meal and asking after her comfort, but he shared little about himself. She learned he was 28, had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, and had worked cattle drives before saving enough to purchase his own land 3 years prior. Beyond that, he kept his own counsel. It was during her 3rd week at the ranch that Lillian first heard him play. She had been hanging laundry in the yard when the soft strains of a fiddle drifted from the barn. Following the sound, she found Zach sitting on a hay bale, eyes closed as he coaxed a melancholy tune from the instrument cradled under his chin. Lillian stood transfixed, unwilling to interrupt. When the last note faded, Zach opened his eyes and saw her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. I didn't mean to intrude. No intrusion. He lowered the fiddle to his lap. My mother taught me, said every man should have some beauty in his life even if he lives rough. It was beautiful, Lillian offered. Sad though, Zach smiled faintly. Most beautiful things carry a touch of sadness, I find. Something shifted between them that day. Zach began joining Lillian on the porch after dinner, sometimes with his fiddle, sometimes just to talk as the sun set behind the distant mountains. She learned of his childhood in a small Pennsylvania town, his brief and terrible experience in the war's final year, and his journey west seeking something he couldn't quite name. In turn, Lillian shared stories of her large, strict family, her secret dreams of having her own business someday, and her fear that she had made an irrevocable mistake by defying her father. You regret it? Zach asked one evening, his voice thoughtful. Refusing the marriage. Lillian considered the question seriously. No, she finally said. I would rather face uncertainty than certain misery. Brave, Zach commented, or foolish, she countered with a small smile. Often the same thing viewed from different angles. As summer faded into autumn, Lillian found herself watching for Zach's return each day, her heart quickening at the sight of him riding over the ridge. She told herself it was merely gratitude for his kindness, but in quiet moments, she acknowledged a deeper truth: she was falling in love with the quiet, thoughtful cowboy who had saved her from destitution. Whether he felt anything similar, she couldn't tell. Zach remained respectful, never crossing the boundaries of propriety. But sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, only for him to look away quickly when their eyes met. The first frost came early that year, painting the valley in silvery white overnight. Lillian woke to find Zach already on the porch, staring out at his frosted fields with concern. Is something wrong? She asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Early cold snap. We need to move the herd to the lower pasture. He turned to her, his expression apologetic. I'll be gone a few days with Frank and Tommy. Will you be all right here alone? The thought of being alone at the ranch sent a flicker of anxiety through her, but Lillian nodded. I'll be fine, just be careful. Zach studied her face. I could ask Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring ranch to stay with you. No, Lillian said firmly. I'm not afraid. This is my home too now. The words slipped out before she could consider them. Something warm flickered in Zach's eyes. Yes, he said softly, it is. The men departed after breakfast, driving the cattle toward the sheltered valley 3 miles south. Lillian watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned to the empty house with determination. She had survived worse than a few days of solitude. The first day passed uneventfully. Lillian baked bread, mended shirts, and read by the fire as an early darkness fell. The second day brought heavy clouds and a biting wind that rattled the windows. By evening, snow began to fall light at first, then heavier, driven by gusting winds that howled around the eaves. Lillian added extra wood to the fire and lit all the lamps, fighting back the shadows and worry. Zach and his men were experienced. Surely they had found shelter from the storm. Still, sleep eluded her as the blizzard intensified through the night. Dawn brought no relief. Snow continued to fall, already piled high against the house. Lillian struggled to reach the barn, determined to feed the remaining horses and chickens. The cold bit through her clothes and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. By the time she returned to the house, her fingers were numb despite her gloves. As dusk approached on the third day, Lillian's worry deepened into fear. The storm showed no signs of abating, and there had been no word from Zach. Staring out at the whiteout conditions, she imagined him lost in the blizzard, freezing and alone. The thought was unbearable. Just as she was considering the impossible saddling a horse and searching for them herself, she heard a shout carried on the wind. Rushing to the window, Lillian peered into the swirling snow. At first, she saw nothing. Then, like ghosts materializing from the white void, 3 riders appeared. Lillian flew to the door, throwing it open. Here, she called, waving frantically. This way. The men guided their exhausted horses toward her voice. As they drew closer, Lillian could see they were nearly frozen, hunched in their saddles, faces crusted with ice. Zach was in the lead, his normally strong frame sagging with fatigue. "Thank God," she breathed as they reached the porch. "I feared the worst. Cattle are safe," Zach managed through stiff lips. "Got caught in the storm, coming back." Lillian helped them dismount, supporting Zach's weight as he stumbled. "Frank, Tommy, take care of the horses," she ordered, "then come inside immediately." Half dragging Zach into the house, she settled him before the fire and began removing his frozen outer clothes. His hands were like ice, his face alarmingly pale beneath the windburn. "Foolish man," she murmured, rubbing his hands between her own. "You could have died out there. Had to." "Get back," Zach said, his eyes finding hers. "Couldn't leave you. Alone." Something fierce and protective surged through Lillian. Without thinking, she pressed her lips to his cold fingers. "Don't you dare risk your life for me, Zachary Wilkes." A ghost of a smile touched his blue-tinged lips. "Would do it. Again." Frank and Tommy stumbled in then, breaking the moment. Lillian set about caring for all three men, heating broth and coffee, finding dry clothes, and checking for frostbite. Only when they were warming by the fire, mugs clasped in thawing hands, did she allow herself to breathe properly. The storm raged for 2 more days, confining them to the house. Lillian kept the fire blazing and food plentiful, watching with relief as color returned to Zach's face. Frank and Tommy soon retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Zach and Lillian alone in the main house. On the 3rd night, as they sat before the fire, Zach finally spoke of what had happened. "We got the cattle settled, but the storm came in faster than we expected. Visibility dropped to nothing. We tried to make it back anyway." He shook his head. "Foolish, like you said." "Why take such a risk?" Lillian asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Zach was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I couldn't bear the thought of you here alone, afraid." "I wasn't afraid for myself," Lillian admitted softly. "I was afraid for you." Zach looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Lillian," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I need to tell you something." Her heart quickened. "Yes." "When I found you in Santa Fe, I offered you a position out of decency. But these past months—" He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "I find myself thinking of you in ways that go far beyond employer and employee. I know it's inappropriate. If you wish to leave, I'll understand completely." Lillian felt a smile bloom across her face. "And if I wish to stay," hope dawned in Zach's eyes, "then I would count myself the luckiest man in the territory. Even though I was cast out by my family, even knowing the shame I carry," Zach reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "There is no shame in standing up for yourself. Your father was wrong, Lillian. What I see when I look at you is strength, kindness, and a beauty that goes far beyond your pretty face." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I love you, Lillian Zander. I think I have since that first day in Santa Fe." Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered back. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself." Zach raised her hand to his lips. "Then let me say what's in my heart. Stay not as my housekeeper, but as my beloved, as my wife if you'll have me." "Yes," Lillian answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll have you, Zachary Wilkes." The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the small ranch house, warmth bloomed like spring. Spring did eventually come to the valley, painting the land in wildflowers and fresh green grass. Lillian stood on the porch, watching as Zach worked with a new colt in the corral. The gold band on her finger caught the sunlight, still new enough to surprise her when it glinted. They had married in February, once the worst of winter had passed. Pastor Evans had ridden out from Santa Fe to perform the ceremony in their own home, with Frank, Tommy, Mrs. Campbell, and a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses. It had been small but perfect, much like their life together. Zach looked up, sensing her gaze, and waved. Lillian waved back, her heart full. In the 4 months since their wedding, they had settled into a partnership that went beyond love. They worked side by side, building something neither could have created alone. The ranch was flourishing, with new cattle purchased and the house expanded to include a proper dining room. They had even taken in a young woman named Rosa, who had arrived in Santa Fe in circumstances painfully similar to Lillian's own. Now she helped with the housework and was learning to keep the books, her quiet presence a reminder of how quickly life could change. As Zach finished with the colt and walked toward her, Lillian placed a hand on her stomach, where the newest change grew a secret she would share with him tonight. Their family was already expanding, and the future stretched before them like the vast New Mexico sky, wide open and full of promise. "What has you smiling so mysteriously, beloved?" Zach asked as he climbed the porch steps. "Just thinking about how sometimes being cast out leads to finding where you truly belong," Lillian replied, reaching for his hand. Zach pulled her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "And where do you belong, Lillian Wilkes?" She looked up at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, the man who called her beloved even when she believed herself unlovable. "Right here," she said simply, "with you." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across their land, Lillian knew she had found not just a home, but a haven. What her family had seen as shame had become her greatest blessing. In Zachary Wilkes' love, she had found redemption, purpose, and a joy she had never dared to imagine. And as they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, Lillian silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led her to that bench in Santa Fe, and to the cowboy who had seen not a disgraced woman, but a beloved wife waiting to be found.